I spent a lot of time when I started doing this work thinking that the system was broken. And then there was a point at which it sort of felt like all the pieces fell into place. And I realized that the system's not broken, or justice system's not broken. It's actually operating exactly as it was designed to operate. And so you don't get these types of sentences because you have a system that was constructed with, for example, human dignity at the center. You get these kinds of sentences because we have a system that's designed to dehumanize individuals. And so our job as advocates for our clients is to disrupt that dehumanization that is so much a part of the criminal legal system in this country.
From the very moment a defendant is involved in this system, someone else has control over their story. They want to define that person solely by the crime they may have committed. You have a sentencing date set, and the stakes are high. Both lawyer and client need to do everything in their power to prepare. But the question is, are you ready? I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year defense lawyer, a sentencing consultant, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker. In Set for Sentencing, I'm going across disciplines and outside the box to help both lawyer and client expand their perspective, build on their skills, and get real results in the form of significantly reduced sentences. All of this in service to one goal: to bring more fairness, more compassion, and more justice to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Helping us get set for sentencing today is Liz Vartkessian, Executive Director of ARC, Advancing Real Change, an amazing nonprofit that she's going to tell us all about, and we're going to hear more about her bio as we go forward. But I just want to dig in and say thank you, hello, and thank you for being on Set for Sentencing. Welcome, Liz Vartkessian. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you so much for having me. This is really exciting.
I'm so glad you agreed to do it. So just tell us briefly about ARC. What is the mission, and what's the work you do on the ground?
So the mission of Advancing Real Change is to really bring the humanity of a defendant to the center of their case. And in its most simplistic way, it sort of positions storytelling about who a person is at the core of the litigation. I started working as a mitigation specialist and investigator of human beings almost 20 years ago now in Texas, at a time when Texas was executing people at a pretty rapid clip. Maybe 1 or 2 people a week were being executed in Texas, and folks were getting sentenced to death at extremely high rates in the state as well. And in my work there, I learned very quickly that it's much easier to sentence somebody to die or to execute somebody that you don't see fully as a human being. And so that's the core of the work that we do, is really taking every opportunity to make sure that decision makers see the individual person standing right in front of them, because the decisions that they're making have an impact not just on that individual, but a lot of other people, members of communities, in ways small and large.
Nice. And just hearing you talk about narrative and everything else, anyone can tell right away that we're kindred spirits. But here's how I I think my epiphany when I knew that Liz was like soul sister in this whole struggle. I was attending and presenting at a wonderful mitigation seminar put on by ARC, and Liz opened up with the keynote. And tell me what what I'm about to say. So just tell me what you told the audience that shook me to my core.
I spent a lot of time when I started doing this work thinking that the system was broken. And then there was a point at which it sort of felt like all the pieces fell into place. And I realized that the system's not broken, or justice system's not broken. It's actually operating exactly as it was designed to operate. And so you don't get these types of sentences because you have a system that was constructed with, for example, human dignity at the center. You get these kinds of sentences because we have a system that's designed to dehumanize individuals. And so our job as advocates for our clients is to disrupt that dehumanization that is so much a part of the criminal legal system in this country.
And how do we disrupt?
We disrupt it by telling the stories of our clients, and we do it in so many ways. And one of the ways you and I are kindred spirits is that we see so much value in not just the language that's used, right, but all the other ways in which we can really bring the stories of our clients, their families, their communities, the history of an individual in front of people. And so whether that is through just straight up verbal narrative, whether it's through photographs, whether it's through videos or other types of ways to connect a decision maker to the experiences of our clients, that's how we disrupt it. The system wants to move quickly, and it wants to move in a way that makes everybody singular, right? There, these narratives of what's good and bad, good and evil, right? Well, the truth is there's a lot of gray in between. And those are the spaces where real understanding about why people engage in certain behaviors, about where the responsibility lies fully. Is it just with that individual? Did the community have something to contribute to it? How do we understand those dynamics? That's where all of that lives, is in that gray space. And so disrupting dehumanization is all about positioning our work in that gray space.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I talk about this a lot, that the entire system reduces a client to a stack of paper and a file. And that paper's never any good. And from the very, very moment the system gets their hooks into a person, they are in control of the story. The story's written in a police report and, the charging document and all this stuff. So when is it time to take our story back? That's the big question. And how do we do it? I know that the goal is to tell the story, but especially with capital clients, they may come to you with traumatic brain injury, huge amounts of trauma. They're closed off. They don't necessarily know what's important to their defense or their mitigation. Like, how do you get there to mine the raw materials of a story and then fashion it into something that people can understand?
That is a very good question. It sort of gets to the heart of the everyday work that I do as a mitigation specialist. If you think about your own life, right, there is no one document, one person, one experience that makes Doug who Doug is, right, or makes me who I am. It's a collection of things, right? Of places we've spent time, of people we've connected to. You mentioned this idea of the papers that come with the client and how most of them are not helpful to us. Well, guess what? The papers that were written about our clients before they became our clients probably weren't helpful either, right? Because that's what I mean when I say the system is constructed in a way to focus on dehumanizing people. How many times have I looked at school records of my clients and I'm seeing notations in there that are not notations of teachers who have the capacity to really see my client struggling, right? He might be exhibiting some sort of behavior and the teacher is saying, well, he's not paying attention, as if that is something that shouldn't be questioned or he should be punished for, right? Or he's being disruptive in class. Well, what if we looked at that behavior as perhaps an indication that this person is asking for help, right? Something is going on. We're not asking the right questions. So how do we tell these stories? How do we find this information? Well, it takes a lot of time, and it takes being curious to really understand the meaning behind the things that we're looking at. So all the pieces of paper, of which there are many, that I will collect in a particular case, right? I mentioned school records. I want to see any time my client went to a doctor, any newspaper articles. How many times have I come across an article on a client who was in the newspaper for doing something really beautiful, participating in some sort of community cleanup, or, I have this image, as I say that, of a client who was photographed during an unusual snowstorm on a sled going down a hill, right? These are all the things that make us who we are, these moments of struggle and success and love, compassion. So you look for it all. And I can't tell anybody at the front end where you're going to find those things. I just know that you have to look. So it's a bunch of record collection, just like any journalist or good researcher would do. And then it's really spending time in places where my clients have spent time. So, weeks, months in communities, going to family reunions, hanging out at parks, just spending time at churches or mosques, wherever my clients have spent their time. I'm going to spend time in those places too. Understanding a person and being able to tell their story isn't just the facts, it's the feelings. And if I don't know what it feels like to be in those spaces, if I can't really sort of touch the grains of what it's like in that home, in that apartment, in that trailer, it's very hard to articulate to somebody the feeling that a person can have in those spaces. So you really have to step into it.
I'm thinking about the feelings aspect, and it's bringing to mind another way that I think our system is fundamentally broken, which is the way that lawyers are trained. Yeah. We from the very beginning, we go to law school, nobody's talking to us about feelings. They're talking to us about issue, rule, application, and conclusion. What are the facts? Get to it. So the very process that we are pre-programmed to do is go in with the client and be like, here's a police report. This is what the cops are saying. Is this right? Are there any witnesses here who can help us with this defense and everything else? And not only are we missing the whole human aspect and the feeling part, but a lot of lawyers bristle at that. Like, I'm not here to be touchy-feely. This is about the law. And this, so I think you have a double challenge, because not only do you have to mine for the story and create the story, but then you have to rely on the advocate to go into court and deliver the story, which
That's
is
right.
And I go through that a lot of times too with my work and the sentencing videos and things like that. And by the way, it comes to mind this idea of another story that was in that talk about one of your clients who was about to be sentenced to death, and the relationship that was forged with the mitigation people, but the relationship that wasn't forged with the attorney, whose ultimate responsibility it was to help this person. You remember what I'm talking about there? Can you tell that story?
I think so, yeah. So this was a case that my office worked on, and thankfully the client decided to accept a plea offer, so he was able to avoid going to trial. I feel pretty confident that he had a very significant chance of receiving a death sentence had he chosen that path as opposed to taking the plea. And it was difficult. People who are listening to this may not be very far in their legal careers, may be legal adjacent, or maybe legally interested, right? And it might not occur to everybody that taking a plea to life without parole is a profoundly challenging decision. You are saying out loud in a room full of people that you agree to die in prison, that when your mother passes away, there will be somebody who comes to your cell, knocks on your cell door and says, your mom died today. And you will not be able to go to that funeral. You will not be able to grieve with other people. You're missing everything. Life without parole is an extraordinarily severe punishment. And that's what we are asking somebody to accept, so they don't go to trial, they don't get sentenced to death, right? It is a huge amount of trust that has to be built with an individual and the defense team to get to a point where they truly believe that is the best outcome for this particular situation. So this client was no different. And I got word that the documents needed to be signed by my client within a 2-day period. And I was in the middle of Florida. My client was out in Texas. And one of the attorneys on the case let me know that she would be traveling out there to see him. Now, the attorneys in this case, like many well-intentioned attorneys, did not have the bandwidth to spend the kind of time that's really required to develop this sort of trusting relationship. And I
Another
knew,
way, by the way, fundamentally that our system is broken, because
yes.
especially if you're a public defender, and I love public defenders, I was one, but we're overloaded. We don't have the time. But sorry to interrupt.
No, that's absolutely right. And that's why I'm saying like none of this is designed to do anything except dehumanize people and move people as if they're on a conveyor belt, right? If you've got 100 felony cases, can you really spend several hours a week with one client? That's extremely challenging. And what are you giving up by making that decision, right? How many attorneys have I spoken with who are like, well, I could spend all of my time on this capital case, or I can help, 80 other people, right? What's the calculus that you're going to make? These are inherent conflicts. Lawyers should not have to make these kinds of decisions, but the
Yeah.
system is structured in a way to force them into not doing what they need to do for that one client because they've got these 90 other clients. So I knew that this attorney didn't have the relationship with this client. And I was very scared that if she went there on her own, he would not sign those pieces of paper. So I was like, well, I guess this is what's happening today. So I rented a car in Orlando and I drove to Beaumont. I drove straight through the night. I made it to Beaumont in like 14 hours.
Wow.
And, I get there. And when I arrive inside of the prison, my client sees me and sees the attorney, and he is visibly shaking. His body is vibrating. He's crying. He's extremely upset. And after some time together, the attorney pulls out the paperwork and, starts saying, you're waiving all your appeals, all of the harshness of a plea she is explaining to him. And he says to her, I'm going to sign this, but I want you to know a couple of things. The first thing is you should have really seen me more than once in a 2-year period. The second thing is I'm signing this not because of anything that you did, but because of what Liz and her team did. And the lawyer had an opportunity there, right, to take on what he was saying and perhaps thank him for his opinion or sharing that with him. But instead, she looked him dead in the eye and said, I'm your lawyer. I'm not your babysitter. I'm not your mother. I'm not your social worker. I did my job. Talk about dehumanization. Here's a man who is signing over the rest of his life to die in prison.
Yeah.
And she couldn't even in that moment find the grace within her, no matter how she felt about what he was saying, to just acknowledge what he was sharing. And you know what was the most amazing thing about that is that after she said that, he shook his head and he signed and looked at me, and it was like he had said his piece. I wanted to do something. I about fell out of my chair and started yelling at her. It was, when we walked out of that prison, I was like, peace out, lady. I don't want to see you again. It was the grace that he showed, the restraint that he showed.
I have such a
enormous.
pit in my stomach hearing that story, and I've heard it before, and it gets me every time. It makes me think about even the times that I've lost, I've gone down in flames, and I've had clients look me in the eye and thank me because I just sat up and I told their story. And I did get, they know that I put in the time, and I went down in flames. But what mattered more to them is someone saw them and heard them. So thank goodness that client had Liz and her team on the case. So my question is, what I don't think all of us I know that all of us would want Liz and her team on the case if we could, but I don't think all of us can have it. So what kind of cases could ARC Advancing Real Change get into? And then we're going to segue into, okay, what if we don't have an amazing mitigation team? What can we do on our own to help mine for the story?
Yeah. So there are so many, every case in the criminal legal system can use a mitigation specialist. That's the sad truth. And if we talk about how the system is structured to dehumanize people, talk about the canary in the coal mine. Let's really think for a second about what my job is. My job is to bring the humanity of a human being into a process. Why does that need to happen? Because we have a system that recognizes that we have stripped this individual of their humanity, and somebody has to bring it back. Okay. So that's why mitigation could literally be a part of any criminal case, because that's the starting point of where our justice system begins, with dehumanization at its core. So we're the antidote to that. Because there are so many cases we could work on, we prioritize working on cases where the most severe outcome is possible. So death penalty cases, cases with life without parole sentences, severe sentencing or extreme sentencing. We work on cases where an individual has, a drug offense and could be facing 30, 40, 50 years. So we work on all kinds of felony cases, and we work around the country, but we're particularly interested in helping clients who are facing very, very severe outcomes. And Doug, like you were saying, a lot of people this might be some folks' first time really thinking about mitigation in their cases. And you might not know where to find one. You might not know if you can get one, if your jurisdiction will fund finding somebody to work on your case who has the kind of skills. So there are definitely things that you can do. One very basic thing: get yourself a release for some records and bring that to every client. My husband is also a public defender here in the good city of Baltimore, and he is amazing. And we have conversations many times where I will try to give him some tips. And one of the tips I give to him is always have some releases with you and get every client to sign one. A release is an authorization, so you can get records that are privately held on your client. You don't have to wait to ask for that. You could just get it. And if you never use it, that's okay. But that's something very basic. And then you could send those to local hospitals, to Social Security, to the school, to get that kind of record-based information that we were talking about at the beginning. Nice. Some other things is, even if you don't have much time, spend a little bit of time just getting to know your client. Don't walk in there with sort of a list of questions. Even if the best that you can do is to say, I've only got an hour today and I wish that we had more time. But before we start talking about your case, I just want to check in with you. Right?
Yep. Yeah.
Like that little extension of humanity, of just being a person, will reap you so many rewards in terms of the type of relationship that you can build.
And let me add one more little nugget onto that. Is there anybody I can call to let them know what's happening and that you're, that goes a long way.
For sure. But Doug, if you're going to do that, then you actually have to call.
Make the call.
Yeah, you have to make the call. So that's the caveat, right?
Okay.
Yeah. So don't make promises that you can't keep.
Right.
Do not make promises that you can't keep. That's another huge thing I see happen a lot. And that is a deal breaker, because you're going to be doing the same thing that so many other people have done to that person.
All right, so I had on my things to ask you top 5 things a lawyer can do to develop mitigation. I think we've got 3 already. It doesn't have to be 5, but let's keep going if you've got more. We got record releases, spend the time, don't make promises you can't keep. What else?
Any promises you can't keep.
Anything else?
A couple other things. Everybody who engages in criminal defense work, y'all got to know what trauma looks like. So I've got a reading assignment for you. You need to read The Body Keeps the Score. If you only read one thing that I recommend, it is The Body Keeps the Score.
Oh, I've never heard of this. Tell me about it.
No way. Okay, it's by Bessel van der Kolk, who is this incredible trauma expert. And he published this book in 2017. Interestingly, during the pandemic, it returned to the New York Times bestseller list, because I think so many people are trying to understand what it means to live through trauma and how to come out of those experiences more resilient. But this was like mind-blowing when I read it. It completely flipped switches in my head about the ways in which trauma behaves inside of a person. And why, I think we've all had that experience, right? We're with somebody and we're like, why won't they just listen to me? Or why won't they do the thing that I want them to do? Well, he basically says it's because they can't. Like, people are trying the best that they can. So if we can start at that baseline, that's a good place to be. But trauma actually rewires your brain. It rewires the way you are going to respond, and it disconnects you from your body. And so the reason it's so important that practitioners understand these symptoms of trauma is because you could be hearing something from your client, but when you're in person with them and you see their body, they might they can't control automatic body responses. So I used to have a client who his pectoral muscles would start vibrating when he got really stressed. And if I asked him how he was doing, he would say he was fine, because that's what trauma does. It allows your mind to say, I'm fine, but you can't stop what your body's doing. That's why people need to be able to understand what trauma looks like when they're spending time with clients, because that's going to give you some insight. Can you push further? Can you keep asking this question? Somebody's body is saying something to you. This might be, the moment to take a pause, start talking about something else for 5 minutes, and then go back to it, right? So just so many golden nuggets from that book.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. And then of course it's why trauma matters to the offense, or there's often a straight line we can draw that helps not excuse but give context to everything that's happening, right? Okay,
Absolutely.
So I love that. I'm going to have to get that book. Hopefully it's on Audible, because I like to listen to my books.
Oh, it's totally on Audible. Yeah, it's on Audible.
Right.
Yeah, it's great.
Super.
Definitely.
And trauma is everywhere in these cases, not just capital cases. You can attest to that. What else? After trauma, anything? Another list? We got 4.
The last thing I'll say is really think about why you need experts. Ask yourself, is this expert going to say something that humanizes my client, or is getting an expert to help me just another way in which I'm dehumanizing my client? That might sound strange, right?
Yeah.
But any diagnosis is, it's there. You mentioned lawyers want to stick to facts. I hate to say this, but there are no facts. The law is a construct, right? And I'm not trying to go down this meta philosophical hole here.
Right.
But medicine is the same. So if you look at these diagnostic labels, they are creations of people who have their own biases, their own points of view, right? If you look at a label like conduct disorder or antisocial personality disorder, and if you look at that against the list of trauma symptoms, they're the same in many, many ways, right? So you really have to ask yourself, why am I hiring somebody? What is the potential negative outcome of having somebody write a report or get on the stand and say, these are all the problems with this person, right? Okay, yeah, there might be some real struggles and some real issues, but there has to be context to help people understand why that means that person is not broken beyond repair. I think some people have this idea that the way to get leniency in sentencing is to demonstrate hardship, dysfunction, disability, and while those things are meaningful because it indicates obstacles in a person's life, that's not why anybody extends mercy. People extend mercy or a second chance because they believe that another human being has capacity to grow, to be redeemed, to change, to do better, right? And so when I talk about experts and really asking yourself why, how does that fit into the overall narrative about these obstacles and about the capacity for growth, redemption, change, being better, right? That's what I mean about really having to think about, is this going to humanize your client? Is this going to dehumanize your client?
Yeah, and I guess it's probably about the distinction between sympathy and empathy. Mm-hmm. And the idea of sympathy is, look at all these horrible things that happen in their life, please feel sorry for them, versus the empathy, which is understand their journey and see the humanity and understand that could be me or that could be someone I love. So it's a process of otherization versus connection, right? That's the whole goal of seeing their humanity, because we view ourselves as we know our own humanity. And we look at someone who's defined by this crime and said they're a monster, they're not a human being. And we build up a wall. And the idea of the fundamental brokenness is not just a death penalty problem. And in death penalty, that's fundamental brokenness will lead a jury to be more inclined to give the death penalty because there's no they can't see the hope, they can't see the redemption. But it translates on non-capital cases as, well, they're going to do this again, so I better lock them up for as long as possible because they can't control themselves, their brain doesn't work right, whatever.
On that point, Doug, I've interviewed probably close to 100 capital jurors at this point. I have a PhD and my training is in research. And part of my doctoral work was to engage in research with the Capital Jury Project, which is this like wonderful the biggest national capital jury study that's been taking place in the United States. It started in the 1990s. It's gone through several rounds of data collection. I became involved in the last round in 2007, 2008, when it was looking specifically at trying to understand how jurors interpret mitigation evidence. And I interviewed jurors in Texas. And I remember I spent like 10 hours with this one juror. He really advocated for a death sentence for this particular individual. And what was fascinating is that if you asked him like what challenges, like what was the story of this person's life, he was able to recite all of the difficulty, right? This defendant, this capital defendant at the age of 12, was having to go into abandoned homes and pull his mother out of those homes because she was addicted to various kind of drugs. She was engaged in sex work. He was responsible for raising his younger siblings. He would go to school, just like totally unkept. And, teachers remember bringing him clothing because he, would show up dirty and the other kids would make fun of him. This juror remembered all of that, and yet he still wanted to sentence him to death. And after 10 hours of spending time with this juror, he said the thing and it clicked into place. And what he said was, I really viewed my experience like a doctor in a war zone. You have all of these injured people around you, and you could spend your time trying to save a person, but are you going to try to save the person who is unsalvageable? Like they're going to die anyway, so why would you invest in saving them?
Wow.
And that was this moment where I was like, yes, like I see the limit that you hit. You were never shown anything that this individual had the capacity to become. There was nothing forward looking, right? It was just all a litany of the ways in which he had been damaged. And so to this juror, that defendant was unsalvageable and there was no point, right? Let him die. Because like, what's he going to grow into? Where is he going to go? And it had everything to do with the story that defense team told about his family. They told a story that, and I'm using the words of the defense team here, that he was raised in a family of criminals. That was the story. Okay. How is that humanizing? How is that demonstrating that there are going to be people in this individual's life that he can connect with, he can grow from, right? How have those people changed, right? What's their individual stories been that might be a parallel to the defendants, right? So there were all of these missed opportunities, and what they ended up conveying to the jury was there was no point in trying to give this man an opportunity to live.
I'm so glad you mentioned the Capital Jury Project because I'm so impressed with that work that you've done. And I just want listeners to know, because I'm going to put some links in the show notes. There's a million articles, well, not a million, but there's a handful of amazing articles that you've co-authored with a lot of other experts in the field as a result of your extensive research with these jurors. And I have found it immensely helpful, not just Capital Work's a small portion of what I do, but it's important for all of it. And the fun, a little aside, is one of the researchers and one of your co-authors is Professor Marla Sandys, who was one of my all-time favorite criminal justice professors in undergrad. So, and I'm pretty sure Marla is brought me to you. That was the connection.
Yeah, she did.
And I just made a note because I'm like, oh, I haven't asked Dr. Sandys to be on this podcast. podcast yet.
Oh, you should.
So
Yeah,
I
you
am
should.
definitely sending an email as soon as we. But definitely check out some of those articles, and it's a pretty good segue into. There's been research and writing in these articles and in your studies on the idea of remorse. And just to preface this, because most of the time, most of my experience in capital cases is through the sentencing mitigation videos. And so we have these great stories to tell and everything else, but sometimes, we win and sometimes we don't. And I just feel like a lot of the times it's coming down to this issue of, did the juror see that this person had genuine remorse? And, these trials last for months, and the client is forced to sit there, and they're just being silently judged, by their every little micro move and their body language and everything. And they're making these assessments about the person that really probably mean nothing in the grand scheme of things. But tell me about the role that remorse plays in the death penalty, whether the jurors impose it or not.
The way that I understand remorse is like, it's just one shorthand way that jurors will think about the humanity of the defendant. And that's why it can appear to loom very large when you talk with jurors in the aftermath of a decision that they've made. I've spoken with plenty of jurors who are still like themselves. The jury is out on whether that person had remorse, but they decided not to sentence this person to death. And that decision came about because there were other avenues that allowed them to see the defendant as a person who didn't need to have this sentence. And that's also shorthand for, they could see that this person had people who loved him. There was a future, there was a reason, right? He was a good father. He had been a good worker. He had tried. He may have failed, but he made these efforts, right? Like those are the same sorts of connections that remorse will also forge between a juror and a capital defendant. Remember, most jurors, certainly most capital jurors, have had like no experience, no direct experience. They are not system involved. They have not really had family members who have been system involved. For so many of the jurors that I've spoken with, this might be their first or second time ever setting foot in the courthouse. Their sum total of experience thinking about people who have committed murder would be like Law and Order, the ID channel, right? Any kind of like crime shows. And I'm not belittling that at all, because this is how people get information at this point. Yeah. And those are the same stock stories across the board, right? It is, this person's done something evil and look at them. And so they're entering this space and they're immediately thinking, well, this defendant wouldn't be here if they didn't really have evidence on him. So you're not starting from a position of believing the person is innocent. They think that because he's been charged and a trial is happening, that's like enough.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah. Definitely. Same in non-cap. Why would they be here if they weren't?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So a lot of this that we're talking about is the tools that the lawyers can gather to help tell their story. But at a certain point, and tell me if I'm wrong, but it's very useful for the decision maker, be it a jury in a capital case or a judge in a non-capital case, to hear and see and hold court and spend some time one-on-one with the human being. And they have to communicate something to that decision maker. And a lot of barriers exist in communication for even us who are trained to do this our whole lives. So do you have any advice for lawyers or sort of mechanism tools that you have in your toolbox to help an accused get to a place where they themselves can communicate their humanity to the decision maker?
You got to like your client. You actually have to like your client. People can tell when you don't. So when we're talking about communicating things to decision makers in death penalty cases, my clients are not going to testify. They're going to sit there, right? And they're going to be encouraged to sit there and not really show any expression. because expressions, can be interpreted, and a lack of expression can be interpreted too, right? So you are the lawyer. By extension, your behavior and your mannerisms become an extension of the client's in that regard. So if you don't really feel comfortable with your client, people are going to be able to tell. And you talked about remorse in the Capital Jury Project. There's this amazing study by Thomas Brewer. He found that 2/3 of jurors were more likely to sentence a capital defendant to life if they believed that the lawyer had a strong working relationship with the defendant. Right? How do you even, where does that come from? It comes from your body language. It comes from the fact that you've poured a glass of water from your client, or that you've leaned over to tell him something. You may have touched his shoulder, right? Like, you are the extension in that instance, right? And so for clients who are not going to get up and be able to tell their story separately, I would highly recommend that lawyers really think about the role that they play in their presence and their own representation of how they feel. It's important.
In some jurisdictions, ours in Maricopa County, the client has an opportunity to allocute, so where they can stand up and they're not necessarily going to be subject to cross-examination. And it seems to me that the lawyers want them to do that when they can. It's the only opportunity they're ever going to have to hear from them. Do you have experience with that, and any advice on how to prepare a client to do that?
Yeah. So in our non-capital cases, we've done that. In a number of our juvenile resentencing cases in particular, where we've been able to, be in a similar position where the client can allocute. I think the best advice I have is not to be too heavy-handed with reshaping what the client is saying. Authenticity is extremely meaningful. And I think it is both empowering and even potentially restorative for a client to be able to put the words to the experience themselves. I think helping the client get to a place where they can deliver that message in a way that, like, they have confidence over and sincerity about. When I've seen allocutions that don't feel good, it tends to be because I'm sort of listening and I'm like, I don't really know if this doesn't feel authentic to that person, right? And so I kind of like think about it like the bullshit test, right? Like, we're all sort of we're suspicious, like, people are going to be suspicious. And so the language, the emotion, it has to be authentic to the person. So working with your client to get to a place where that is what it is, and not being too heavy-handed, I have found works best for us.
Yeah. I tend to agree with that. Even with sentencing letters that our clients sometimes write, I will help them. I won't help them by telling them what to say, but I'll help them to draw out the information.
That's right.
And just in the basic storytelling 101, the best stories are the ones that contain details, the specifics. That's what gives credibility and context and emotion and depth. And so, it's so easy for a client to get up and say, I'm real sorry, I feel real bad. And a judge has heard that a million times. And so I want to know, like, okay, what are you sorry about? And what do you really think the effect on the victim was? What do you think they're going? There's a really cool lawyer in Detroit named Patrick Barone, and he's on the podcast. He'll be on the podcast, but he is trained in psychodrama. Have you ever heard of that?
Cool. I have. Yeah.
So, I'll put that in the show notes too. But and I didn't know about it before I met Patrick, but that strikes me as one interesting tool that we could use to draw this out.
I think that's really good advice. And I'll just say this too, like, I'm working on a non-capital, non-juvenile case right now, and my client is innocent, and he is, I mean, there's a whole lot.
That's a hard allocution to do when they're innocent. Yeah.
And this is what we're talking about a lot, because he has a few avenues of relief, one of which is a sentencing modification, and one which is, clemency application, and it is very challenging, because in both of those things, if you don't take responsibility, you are unlikely to be successful. So where does that leave an innocent person who has already spent nearly 30 years in prison and will, never, I mean, he's innocent. He will, his preference is obviously to be released, but he will never confess to something that he did not do.
Yeah.
So how do you allocute in that situation? And working with him to really get to a place where he can talk in the way that you were mentioning about how he understands like what this loss has been to so many people, right? And that can stand independent, right? That like the thing that he wants more than anything is the same thing that everybody in the situation wants, which is an answer, right? And that like he can allocate in that way, right? Without demeaning the loss and the horror of what the family has lived through, right? Like there are ways to think about how do we tell stories that elevate, right, the important pieces for our clients, and giving them guidance on how to do that, right?
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. That's amazing. Well, the hardest videos I do are when someone went to trial and they are convicted and they can't fall on their sword and they can't show remorse. But the interesting thing is when you just tell their story and their humanity and their whole life of good works and everything else, then I feel like you're putting it on the decision maker now to reconcile. Okay, the jury said this, but nothing in this person's history makes sense measured up against this. And I think the story behind this story is maybe there is some doubt about what happened. If you have that great life story that, impeccable. But, okay, so we did top 5 things that a lawyer can do to develop mitigation in a case. This podcast is really not just for lawyers. My hope is that people who are in trouble or looking for answers, they might find us and get some great advice on how they can help themselves. So what would be some advice that you would have for a client to help their lawyers better tell their story?
If you are a client and you have the capacity to do that, right? Because, everybody's capacity is going to be different. I sort of start from a position of more details, the better. I don't know what that individual's life circumstances at the moment, right? But it's so hard to know what the piece of information is that is really going to be that connective factor. So like if I was in person with somebody, I would be doing what I call day in the life interviewing, which is like, walk me through what it's like at the age of 6 to wake up wherever you are. Who's there? Where are you? How do you get up? What do you do first? How do you get to school? All of those things, right? So as much detail as a person can remember, I think is pretty helpful. And whether that's something that you can share with your lawyer in written form, or if your attorney or members of your team can be present and you can share it like that, I think that's great. Because, we don't know what is helpful sometimes. So the more you can share, right, the better. I would say that's a big thing.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think it's along the same lines. I will ask the client, but if your lawyer doesn't ask, volunteer. Tell me something that you're really good at. What makes you tick? Like, and maybe they play the piano. Maybe it's they care for animals. Like, who knows? But these are the things that are going to open up these amazing human stories. So tell me, I want to know, if your lawyer doesn't ask about you because we're broken, we are fundamentally broken and trained to get to the point, just the facts. You just say, listen, dude, or ma'am, this is what you need to know about me.
Yeah, absolutely.
Anything else?
I think
try to stay out of trouble, and if you're incarcerated, that's helpful.
Would be ideal. That would be ideal.
Sometimes that's hard.
Sometimes it's impossible, but that would absolutely be ideal. What I'm going to say is really, I think, like, challenging, because I can imagine that it's just so hard, but do your best to trust your lawyer.
Yeah.
Trust is a two-way street. And so I get that if your lawyer's not coming around or responding to you, it is a tough thing.
Yeah.
But, I've seen situations where, my client is right, lawyer hasn't been around. And like, this is also going to be the person who is responsible for helping you. And so to not give up and to just kind of like keep at it, I think that's really important.
Yeah.
As frustrating and unfortunate as that can be.
And please tell me if you don't understand what I'm talking about. So many times, we're also trained to use big words, which is so stupid. We're not trained to talk like human beings. We're trained to talk like lawyers, but even the small words sometimes in the context of the legal system are very complicated, and it doesn't make sense. And a lot of times I think my clients just don't want to admit that they just don't. Some of them I didn't even know they couldn't read until way, way deep into the case. Don't be ashamed about that.
Right.
You're not alone, but we need to know. We need to know what your baseline is.
That's why I was saying, like, if you've got like whatever your position is, right? Some people might not, have literacy skills. Some people may not be very verbal. Some people, everybody communicates in different ways, right? And I hate to put the onus on a person who is already experiencing so much. But whatever is your best form of communicating, leaning into that, and doing that to the best effect that you can, I think will be helpful. Also, sharing, I have a lot of clients who are not verbally expressive, and they are not really expressive in writing, but they are phenomenal artists. I mean, if that's the way you communicate, like, lean into your art. Like, there is meaning, there is power, right? You might need to draw a picture of something instead of writing it through words. That's fine. Really thinking about like how are you able to bring pieces, to your team, to your attorney, and it could very well be through art, through various forms of art.
Yep. And I'm going to use that art to communicate your humanity to the decision maker because, artists, I mean. So, okay, we're running out of time, and that bums me out because I have at least 1,000 more questions on my list. But I learned something very interesting in the last 24 hours, and that is you're writing a book. And it's about what working with people who've committed murder can teach us about justice. Am I right about that?
That is correct.
Okay. So
yes.
what can working with people who've committed murder teach us about justice? I don't want you to give the whole book away, but
Yeah, it teaches so much. I mean, first it teaches us that justice is elusive. And that it's not something that it's not going to be because of a punishment we're giving to somebody. Ultimately, it's going to be more to do with the way we understand how we can reframe the questions we're asking as a society, right? We started off our conversation today talking about disrupting dehumanization. The most singular way that we can do that is if we could just imagine a different kind of system that placed the dignity of an individual at the center of the process, right? So if we started every single criminal case with the question, what would it take to restore this person to be able to return to the community and be successful? What would our sentencing look like? As opposed to the questions that we're asking now, which are things like, how much pain can we inflict on an individual for doing something harmful, right? These are extremely different lenses through which we can understand what it means to seek justice. And essentially what I'm saying is that none of us come out of this process with the questions that we're asking right now any better. And we don't come out of this process with any hope of not seeing the same kind of harms perpetrated. I don't want to see murder happen. And in almost 20 years of doing this work, I've only worked with people who have committed murder. I can tell you that most murders are actually, you could have prevented it. But it's not because somebody else was there and had a gun and could have killed my client. It's really through the types of social structures that we have allowed to fall into total disrepair, or were never built with any integrity in the first place. And so that's what I've learned about justice, is that if we really want it and we really want life to look different for the future, we would be asking different questions, and we would stop having this system of good and evil, of monster and man, right? Like, that's just not where we would be at.
I think that's probably the place we should end. They tell us lawyers to start with a bang and end with a bang, and that was pretty amazing stuff. So I will say that I want people to go to Advancing Real Change, the website. It's arc.org, right?
It's advancedchange.org.
Advancechange.org. Okay.
Yep.
I'll put it in the show links. The first thing you're going to see on there is narratives build bridges, which sums up this whole talk that we had that was so awesome. But if you scroll down a little ways more, you're going to see opportunities where you can actually get involved, which is maybe a donation to ARC or volunteer work or any number of things. So I would encourage people to reach out. There's trainings. You guys put on amazing trainings, and they're almost always free, right?
Yeah, I think they're all free. We've never charged.
They're all free. Yeah. So you can get on the mailing list, especially if you're a lawyer and you want some amazing free trainings. You even give CLE credit for that sometimes, right? So
yeah, we've got a resource clearinghouse, to your 5 things that people could do. There's a lot of resources there. We want to make sure folks don't need to feel like they're reinventing the wheel. And they've got easy access, for some basic components of doing this work themselves.
Amazing. Thank you so much for coming on today. I hope we get to do this again, because I got a lot more to talk to you about, but this was an incredible start. So thank you. Good luck.
Yeah, and thank you for doing this. Yeah, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. I appreciate it.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you like the podcast, please do me a favor. Spread the word about Set for Sentencing and give us a rating and review on the iTunes podcast platform. It would really help. Last but not least, if you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassonlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.